Hello, my friends, and welcome to Written Voices for this fine day. I'm Alan Hunkin, your host. Glad to have you aboard today. In fact, it's important that you are aboard today because we're going to talk about something that is so pervasive throughout North America and such a serious challenge, a serious problem facing us. It's so pervasive, actually, it's kind of becomes invisible to us. And because of that, we need to take notice. And the conversations that have been had about this particular subject have been going on. Lots of people are talking about it, but every year the problem gets worse. So obviously the conversation that we're having is not the right one. The book is called The Fattening of America, How the Economy Makes Us Fat, If It Matters, and What to Do About It. Eric A. Finkelstein is with us. He is a PhD, MHA, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, published many articles on the economics of obesity. His research has appeared in top health and medical journals and been the subject of countless news stories. He's been featured on USA Today, The Economist, Time, Forbes, The Washington Post, and many other newspapers and magazines, and now Written Voices. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
I'm delighted to have you. This is one of the single most important subjects going on right now. I got lots to say, and I got lots of questions. So instead of that, tell us why you wrote it and what this book is about.
Sure. As you know, obesity is certainly in the media day after day, and the rising rates of obesity have received lots of attention. But in my view, people have not focused so much on obesity as an economic phenomenon. And so what I tried to do in this book was essentially recast what we know about obesity and think more broadly, not just in terms of rising rates of obesity, but in terms of the underlying causes behind these rising rates, as well as some of the consequences. And in fact, I make the argument throughout this book that obesity is really more of an economic phenomenon than a health issue.
Well, yes, by reverse engineering, one would say, okay, let's just work backwards. Every year, North America gets more obese, so therefore something is working harder at helping us to be obese than not helping us to be obese.
That's right, and in fact, it's not something, it's lots of things. And in fact, your audience certainly wouldn't be surprised when we talk about the stories with respect to food consumption and food prices. In fact, food prices, up until very recently, had dropped fairly rapidly since the 1970s, and so people are, not surprisingly, eating out more, eating larger portions. Food manufacturers are increasing their portion sizes as a way to attract hungry consumers. And, and then we can talk about the technology on the other side, where basically we've engineered physical activity out of our lives. And in fact, the story goes on beyond that when you talk about increases in medical technology, which in my mind, and I talk about in the book, have really allowed us to be fairly healthy without really having to diet and exercise.
Yes, you talk in the book about, there's lots of blame to go around, but that isn't obviously, Eric, getting us very far because nothing seems to be happening, or at least not much.
Well, you're right, and I think there's two ways to look at that. And one of the things that I say in the book is that obesity is essentially a byproduct of a successful economy, and we may not be happy about the obesity, but we certainly seem to be happy about all the products that we have that we didn't have a few decades ago, and, we like the low food prices. And so the question that I ask and I think answer in this book is, sure, we're fatter, but are we better off?
Well, it's like a lot of other things. The real true costs and ramifications are deferred, aren't they? Almost to the end of a particular generation and then into the next generation, because really the people that are obese, and I put myself in that category, we don't have to pay for it. It's our kids that are going to have to pay for it.
Well, you're talking paying for it in terms of dollars, but you certainly are going to pay for it in terms of increased health risk down the road, and if you're not already, odds are you're going to develop diabetes at some point if you're large enough, and in fact, you'll be much more likely to get on drugs for high cholesterol and high blood pressure and others. So you do pay in terms of increased health risk, but you're right in terms of medical expenditures. Those are going to be shared here in the U.S., for Medicare and Medicaid as well as private insurers. So those costs are certainly spread among the population, and so in a sense, you're correct. We all do pay for rising rates of obesity.
Who's listening and who's not listening to this dilemma that actually has some power to change things?
Well, I think everybody is listening, but I think the question is, are we saying the right message? And what I argue in the book is that telling people you're obese or you're fat and being fat is bad for you, it makes you more likely to get all these diseases, is not particularly helpful, because if you believe my story, people already know that. And in fact, I cite statistics in the book to suggest that people know that they're obese and that they know that it makes them more likely to be unhealthy, but what they also know is how much work it takes to weigh less, and so I argue that it's just, for many people, just not worth it. And so that message is a waste of time.
The conspiracy theorists, have a heyday with this one. It's the food companies that are putting stuff into the food that makes us hungrier and makes us want to eat more. And, there's other factions, the government and this kind of thing, that they're all kind of conspiring against us in this regard. How much of that do you think is true?
Well, I think that food companies, if you call it a conspiracy, are certainly out to maximize profits, and to the extent that getting us to eat more is certainly consistent with that profit motive, I think they do everything they can to try to get us to eat more. But I think the question at the end of the day is, are we eating more because we are somehow tricked into eating more, or is it a conscious choice that we could change if we wanted to? And I make the argument in the book that there are certainly situations where we eat more than we might like, but, could we not over-exercise to make up for that? And in fact, if we're eating too much, at some point we should be seeing that we're weighing more than we like, and then the question is, why aren't we trying to change our behaviors to get us to weigh less?
Does the government profit from obesity?
No, in fact, I think the government is pretty unhappy about it. As you rightly pointed out earlier, Medicare and Medicaid expenditures are significantly higher. We published a paper that shows that the government spends about $45 billion a year treating obesity-related diseases in the Medicare and Medicaid population. So clearly they would like people to be thinner. I think the problem is the government's, on the one hand, trying to get people to be thinner, and then on the other hand, subsidizing corn and soy-based products that are promoting increased consumption of high-fructose corn syrup and hydrogenated fats and oils. I don't think they're doing that to get people to be thinner, but I think they're doing that because there's a lobby out there in the Midwest that is encouraging just that kind of subsidy.
You mentioned diabetes, and yes, you were in fact correct. I do have type 2 diabetes, and so, had to start looking at what I was eating and how much I was eating. And the first thing you discover is that good quality food, the right kind of food, is more expensive than junk food and high-carb foods. So isn't it a simple equation of starting to tax the foods that are less good for us?
Well, I've been in this business a long time, and one thing that I found is that nothing is simple when it comes to obesity. And let me point a few examples. First off, your idea about the high price of food is certainly valid. Healthy foods, on some level, do cost more, but it's not so obvious. In fact, if you look at men, for example, wealthy men don't weigh less than poor men. In fact, income, once you control for race, there's very little difference in obesity rates by income status. So that says to me, being poor is not really what's causing men to weigh more. When you look at women, there is an income effect, but it's not nearly as large as, say, the impact of being black or of being Hispanic. And so this poverty relationship is not as obvious as you might think. And getting back to the food taxes, well, I think you first need to ask the question is, why should I, as a government, tax people to try to get them to eat healthier and to weigh less? And I think that's not an easy question to answer.
Yes, but amongst the stakeholders in this are, governments, corporations, and individuals. Who amongst these stakeholders has the most power to have the most effect the fastest?
Well, I guess I would go back to the question in the book. As you know, I talk a lot about my Uncle Al. My Uncle Al certainly is in the best position to change his weight. He's a very wealthy, very successful, very bright attorney, and he's also very obese. And the question I think that I would ask before you start thinking about trying to get Uncle Al to weigh less is who should be trying to get him to weigh less and why. And I make the argument that there aren't particularly good justifications for the government to get Uncle Al to weigh less. His employer, he's self-employed, but if he weren't, his employer certainly has some motivations, but Uncle Al probably has the greatest motivations because he's the one who has to deal with all these health conditions, and if he's not, willing to change his behavior and increase his diet and exercise regimen, it's not so obvious that we should try to coerce him into doing that. Now, you'll probably say, well, but he has all these high medical expenditures. Why should we pay for those? And I would say, well, that's a nice point, but if you're unhappy about paying for his medical expenditures, maybe you should just charge him a higher rate, and then he can choose to be obese or not obese, and it wouldn't cost you any more money.
Well, certainly, I have no problem with that. Every ounce of fat that I have on my body, I put there myself with one bite at a time, as you know. But here's an interesting thing, and let me throw out a theory that I've had, and it doesn't have much to do with economics, but it does in a way, and it'd be interesting to hear your response to it. I've been saying in seminars for quite some time that what I think that the byproduct of the capitalist system overall, one of the unintentional byproducts of it, is a kind of low-grade franticness. It comes from constant stimulation to buy this, need that, do something else to get ahead or whatever. And because we're stimulating those ideas all the time, we create a need to have that, and therefore a franticness, a low-grade franticness, in order to go out and achieve that. And then that low-grade franticness then creates all kinds of things. And I think one of the things that it does to us, besides raising our cortisol levels and stress levels, is that it causes us to deal with anxiety, partly through eating. So my take on this has been that this is pervasive because it's the entire ocean that we're swimming in, not just the individual waves, therefore. And that in order to really get a handle on this, we're going to have to start to modify the system. Now, I know that's a big idea, and it's probably, I don't have the education or the awareness to say how to do that. But my feeling is, my sense of being in self-help for 35 years, is that this is what's going on. Does that translate at all into the economics that you talk about in this book?
Probably not. I mean, I would make the argument that, not that you're not correct about your hypothesis, but I would argue that nothing explains rising obesity rates better than falling food prices and new technologies that promote sedentary behavior. Now, I would argue that those technologies may also be promoting this frenzy that you're describing, but I think even in the absence of that frenzy, we'd be eating more and exercising less as a result of changes in technology. I would also point out that I feel the frenzy and the stress, believe me. I also relieve that stress by working very hard at dieting and exercising. I'm sort of an exercise fiend. I kind of went in the extreme other direction. And so I think there's some question about why some people choose to go one way and others choose to go another direction. But I think that the frenzy that you're describing and the rise in obesity rates is more causally driven by these changes in relative prices. And I think what you're describing is really a byproduct of these changes.
You've had now enough time to get some feedback on the book and what people think of it, what they think the result will be. I'd be interested in hearing what other people are saying about it, and then also what you think the takeaway is going to be for the readers of this book.
To me, the takeaway point of this book is essentially that, yeah, obesity is a problem for some, but for others, if given the choice between, having to make some fairly difficult choices to try to weigh less versus carrying some extra pounds and having an increased risk of certain diseases that will require lots of medical treatment, but potentially no reduction in mortality, many well-intentioned, bright, educated, wealthy people are going to say, you know what, I'd rather be fat and happy, essentially, than to have to spend all this time dieting and exercising. And from my perspective as an economist, I think that's okay, and I think that's a very different perspective than what public health folks would say, who want people to be healthier in spite of what their choices might be. And so I think that's an important point of the book, and one that I think is not so obvious and many people may take issue with. But the second point that I want to make is that I do argue in the book that obesity is a byproduct of our technology and changes in relative prices, but I also think that our advancing economy is what's going to solve this problem. And there's two ways it's going to happen, and I'm certain there will come a time when a drug or a technology will keep people thin, and public health folks may not like that, but I think lots of people who would much rather take these pills than to have to diet and exercise, and economists would say, well, if that's what they want to do, that's fine with them. But short of that, I also think technology is going to essentially find a way to re-engineer physical activity back into our lives. And to that point, I just bought the Wii video game system for my kids for the holidays because I think the Wii is a great way to get physical activity through doing something that my kids are really excited about. And we know kids love video games. They love the Wii, and it gets them healthy. And so that's one of many examples. Dance Dance Revolution is another. But I think there are going to be lots of opportunities to get physical activity as a result of new technologies that will allow people who want to be more active to do so in some pretty cool, creative ways. And so I think that's a positive take-home message from the book.
Yeah, and one final thing, too, I think, Eric, is that you can find other ways. And we didn't talk about the diet industry or the gym, the exercise industry, but, you know, at one point in time it was like go to the gym and burn it out of you, you know, work it out of you. And I'm less than enthusiastic about that. But last year I joined a choir, Soul Gospel Choir, and we do dancing while we're singing. We do these movements, right? Well, man, I'm telling you, it is a workout and a half, an hour and a half of singing in front of a crowd and dancing at the same time. You know, you can find ways to move that don't involve slogging it out at the gym.
That's right, you can. I think the economist in me wants to say, or you can choose not to, and maybe that's okay too. I mean, for myself, I have 3 kids and very little time, and so I work out incredibly hard for 35 minutes 4 days a week, because to me, I would prefer to do that and be thin than to have to spend either more time exercising or way more. But these are choices that I knowingly make, and you sound like the choir is the right thing for you. For my Uncle Al, it's basically neither. And my point is, you know what? That's okay.
It is okay. And the book, The Fattening of America, is an important read because it will give us a much greater scope of what this is all about. The author, Eric A. Finkelstein, How the Economy Makes Us Fat, If It Matters, and What to Do About It. The Fattening of America. Eric, thanks so much for joining us on the program today.
Oh, you're quite welcome. Thanks for having me.
This is Alan Hunkin for Written Voices. Thanks very much for joining us. Bye for now.